Hey Nutmeggers, welcome to another exciting edition of Primo Nutmeg. We have a jam-packed show for you today. Returning to the show is our old friend Kevin Carson. Kevin and I are going to discuss 21st century anarchism. I'm going to ask him about several different modern anarchist thinkers, including Noam Chomsky, David Graeber, and Roderick Long. But before that, I did want to run through several headlines. This has been a huge week for news, lots of different things going on. As I'm sure everyone knows, this past week Robert Mueller testified before Congress. Essentially, a very sleepy and lethargic Robert Mueller did not answer the questions posed to him by Congress. He referred back to his report several times. There were points during his testimony when he could not remember sections of his own report. He frequently had trouble hearing the questions that he was receiving, and also finding the sections of the report that he was being asked about. It was essentially just hours of congressmen trying to get sound bites out of Robert Mueller, and being unsuccessful for the most part. But again, essentially Robert Mueller said nothing. And of course, it's because we know Russiagate itself is nothing. It's a conspiracy theory based on several different things that really have nothing to do with each other. The Trump Tower meeting, the leaking of DNC emails, which, by the way, we don't really know that much about because the FBI both never examined the DNC servers and also never saw the final unredacted report from CrowdStrike. Then you had the ridiculous Facebook ads for Bernie Sanders coloring books and Jesus arm wrestling Satan. Of course, there was only about $100,000 behind these ads, and most of them went up after the election. Furthermore, in the swing states that Trump won, only about 1,000 people saw these ads, which is not even enough to swing the outcome of the vote. And we just see this time and time again. The heart of the accusation that Donald Trump colluding with the Russian government to alter the outcome of the election is false. That's why Robert Mueller ended up indicting Russians who will never see a day in court. That's why all of the arrests are around people making false statements, or around tax fraud, or other bullshit charges that have nothing to do with collusion. And that's also why you now see neoliberal Democrats harping on the issue of obstruction, because they're doing what every conspiracy theorist does when they don't have proof to back up their conspiracy theory. You allege a cover-up, and that's what Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and Adam Schiff are now doing, because there is no evidence behind their central claim that Donald Trump is a Manchurian candidate working for Vladimir Putin, despite all of the evidence showing that Donald Trump has been aggressive towards Russia, from ripping up the INF treaty, to selling weapons to Ukraine, to being hostile towards Iran and Venezuela and bombing Syria. Despite all of that, despite the fact that they in one breath call Donald Trump a traitor and then in the next give him a standing ovation at the State of the Union, and then also vote to give him a higher military budget and expanded spying powers, because that's what you would do with a traitor, right? You would give them more power. But despite all of that, to make up for the fact that Hillary Clinton was a horrible candidate who lost the election, and lost the election based on the policies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, as well as her own neoconservative foreign policy and support for the Iraq War, in order to obfuscate all of that, they're using Russia as a scapegoat. And they're starting a new Cold War which puts the safety of the planet at risk. They're breeding neo-McCarthyism here at home, which goes hand in hand with Silicon Valley censoring folks all across the political spectrum, because at the end of the day, you cannot have Americans actually questioning the Washington Consensus, which has wreaked havoc on this country and the world. So that's why you have to have bullshit sideshows like Russiagate to distract from all of the wars, from the corruption, from the fact that Wall Street robbed the American taxpayers for trillions of dollars. And again, this goes back to why I keep saying partisan politics is professional wrestling. It's all a sideshow. It's a spectacle. It's meant to get you to look over here, and we never actually have a democratic vote on the issues that really impact us and affect us. Instead, next year, we're going to have an election on whether or not Donald Trump colluded with Russia. Meanwhile, folks, you have Congress passing legislation with huge bipartisan consensus. In particular, there was House Resolution 246, which passed this week, with a vote of 398 to 17. Yes, that's 398 members of Congress voted for House Resolution 246, and only 17 members of Congress voted against it. What is House Resolution 246? Well, the title of the bill is opposing the efforts to delegitimize the State of Israel and the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement targeting Israel. So essentially, there's a movement called Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions, or BDS, which is an act of protest against Israel and what they're doing to the Palestinian people. And we've seen this time and time again. There's a strong pushback in Washington against the BDS movement. And we saw it in particular in the roll call for this vote. Now, before we get to the roll call, I do actually want to read the bill. So here it is, House Resolution 246. Whereas the global BDS movement promotes principles of collective guilt mass punishment, and group isolation, which are destructive of prospects for progress towards peace and a two-state solution. Whereas boycotts and similar tools aimed at promoting racial justice and social change have been used effectively in the United States, South Africa, and other parts of the world, and whereas in contrast to protest movements that have sought racial justice and social change, the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement targeting Israel is not about promoting coexistence, civil rights, and political reconciliation, but about questioning and undermining the very legitimacy of the country and its people. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the House of Representatives, 1. Opposes the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS movement, targeting Israel, including efforts to target United States companies that are engaged in commercial activities that are legal under United States law, and all efforts to delegitimize the state of Israel. I don't know how anybody can read that as anything but a full-throated condemnation of the BDS movement. That was the whole purpose of this bill. That's what this bill is. You can throw in as many platitudes as you like about Americans having the right to protest and petition the government, but this is the government setting policy that the United States condemns the boycott of the state of Israel. Now, furthermore, let's go through who voted for this. Again, 398 members of Congress. You couldn't get that much consensus for anything. You couldn't get that for highways. You couldn't get that for a military budget. You couldn't get that for naming a post office. So there was sweeping bipartisan support for this. And even the most progressive members of Congress voted for this. Tulsi Gabbard voted for this. Ro Khanna voted for this. Almost every member of Congress voted for this thing. There were 12 members of Congress who did not vote, and there were 5 who didn't even have the courage to vote one way or the other, including Justin Amash, the supposed libertarian hero. This firebrand, Justin Amash, voted present because he wasn't brave enough to vote yes or no. So please, anybody out there, any libertarian listeners who are big Justin Amash fans, please take a good look at this guy. He's a vocal supporter of Russiagate. He was actually kicked out of the House Freedom Caucus because of his ridiculous support for Russiagate. And now here we have him not even voting one way or another on this piece of legislation, just voting present because he's a coward. Justin Amash is a coward who can only vote present when this piece of legislation is in front of him. But there were 17 members of Congress who did vote against this, and I do just want to give them all props. They showed bravery. Most of them were Democrats, 17. There was only one Republican in the House of Representatives. One Republican who voted against this. That was Thomas Massie. But you also had 16 Democrats voting with Thomas Massie. You had Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, Andre Carson of Indiana, Debbie Dingell of Michigan, Jesus Garcia of Illinois, Raul Grijalva of Arizona, Pramila Jayapal of Washington, Barbara Lee of California, Betty McCollum of Minnesota, Gwen Moore of Wisconsin, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, Chelly Pingree of Maine, Mark Pocan of Wisconsin, Bobby Rush of Illinois, Rashida Tlaib of Michigan, and Bonnie Watson Coleman of New Jersey. Those 16 Democrats, along with Thomas Massie of Kentucky, they are the only brave members of Congress who actually stood up against this legislation. And it's really sad to see that Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna and so many other members of Congress just fell in line behind this piece of legislation. I know that there's a bunch of apologists out there. I know that there's people that are willing to make an excuse for this. But guess what? Tulsi Gabbard was wrong on this. This was something that she got wrong. And I know that people previously were mad at me for pointing out that Bernie Sanders has been wrong on issues. But guess what? Good politicians can be wrong about things. Bernie Sanders can be wrong about Russiagate. Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna can be wrong about this legislation. At the end of the day, we have to give up on these personality cults and actually have some moral and logical consistency. Just because you acknowledge that Bernie Sanders or Tulsi Gabbard might get something wrong, that doesn't mean that you're against them. That doesn't mean that you won't support them. It just means that they got something wrong and we should fight them on that. People should be standing up at town halls and asking Tulsi Gabbard, why did you vote for this? Why did you not show the bravery of AOC or Ilhan Omar? Why did you not stand with them? Why did you stand with the other 397 members of Congress just passing this ridiculous piece of legislation? Why didn't you show any bravery, the bravery that you're typically known for? Same thing with Bernie Sanders. People should be standing up at town halls and asking Bernie Sanders, why are you not speaking out for Julian Assange? Why are you not on the front lines saying, Julian Assange is being persecuted. This is an assault on free speech. Bernie Sanders, more than anyone, should be saying that. Julian Assange showed how the DNC collaborated and conspired against Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election, and why Bernie Sanders might be our president today if not for what happened in the DNC. And Julian Assange exposed that, but Bernie Sanders does not have the bravery to speak out for Julian Assange. Again, Bernie Sanders would be a way better nominee than Joe Biden or Kamala Harris or Elizabeth Warren. That's without question. But he's wrong on those issues, and he's not showing bravery on those issues, just like Tulsi Gabbard did not show bravery on this vote. She may be great on 99% of other issues, but she got this one wrong, and we have to acknowledge that and point that out and hold her feet to the fire and say, Tulsi Gabbard, why the hell did you vote to support a condemnation of BDS? Now, I know that I'm going off on a tangent a little bit, and I know that a lot of people are probably mad at me right now because I'm pointing out that Tulsi Gabbard can be wrong, that she is human, but I do also want to talk about some other news this week, something that Tulsi Gabbard got extremely right, and that I'm very happy about. It just came out that Tulsi Gabbard is going to be suing Google for $50 million, which is some awesome news. And I'm going to read you the story here from the New York Times. I'm sorry to have you hear me read again, but here's what's happening. This story just broke on Thursday. It says Representative Tulsi Gabbard, the long-shot presidential candidate from Hawaii, said in a federal lawsuit that Google infringed on her free speech when it briefly suspended her campaign's advertising account after the first Democratic debate in June. The lawsuit, filed on Thursday in a federal court in Los Angeles, is believed to be the first time a presidential candidate has sued a major technology firm. In a twist that reflects Ms. Gabbard's unorthodox political views, the claim that her speech was stifled by Google is similar to complaints made over the last year in Republican circles. Few Democrats have raised similar concerns. Big tech companies like Google are getting increasing scrutiny by lawmakers and regulators around the world for a wide variety of issues, including their influence on political debate, their handling of consumer data, and the aggressive way they compete with smaller companies. The article goes on, Tulsi Now Inc., the campaign committee for Ms. Gabbard, said Google suspended the campaign's advertising account for 6 hours on June 27th and June 28th, obstructing its ability to raise money and spread her message to potential voters. After the first Democratic debate, Ms. Gabbard was briefly the most searched for candidate on Google. By the way, that's because she was the only one saying anything different. She was the only one questioning our foreign policy. That's why that happened. But anyway, the article goes on, her campaign wanted to capitalize on the attention she was receiving by buying ads that would have placed its website at the top of search results for her name. The lawsuit also said the Gabbard campaign believed its emails were being placed in spam folders on Gmail at, quote, a disproportionately high rate, end quote, when compared with emails from other Democratic candidates. Quote, Google's arbitrary and capricious treatment of Gabbard's campaign should raise concerns for policymakers everywhere about the company's ability to use its dominance to impact political discourse in a way that interferes with the upcoming 2020 presidential election, end quote, the lawsuit said. Ms. Gabbard and her campaign are seeking an injunction against Google from further meddling in the election and damages of at least $50 million. Anyway, the article goes on, but I just thought that this was awesome. You know, we have had this conspiracy theory for the last few years about how Russia is meddling and they're brainwashing people with these Facebook ads and they're under our beds and they're putting fluoride in the water. All this insanity about the Russian boogeyman. But as this is happening, you have Google, Facebook, Twitter, you have these tech giants censoring political dialogue, actually affecting political discourse in this country. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's happening. It's provable. You can see it with people on the right. You can see it with people on the left. It's anyone who questions the establishment dogma. They're flagged, they're put on a blacklist, and they're attacked. You see pages like the Free Thought Project and the Anti-Media taken down from Facebook, who is cooperating with the Atlantic Council to do that. You see people being deplatformed. You see people being demonetized like this channel was for last year. And that actually segues us into the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is the current backlash against independent media and this channel. I recently saw a really cool video from David Pakman where he talked about around May 1st, there was a demonstrable loss in recommended views for independent media channels. And around that same time, it seems as though YouTube turned up the dial for corporate media. So you might notice this. If you go to your YouTube homepage, you probably see a lot of recommended videos for corporate media, CBS, NBC, Fox News. You probably also see a lot of recommendations for late night comedians like Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, and maybe even shows like Saturday Night Live, which do have some political commentary in there. But you're probably seeing less and less from people like Jimmy Dore, David Pakman, the Gray Zone Project, and probably Primo Nutmeg too. Despite this show growing a lot in March and April, we have seen a very strong drop in views over the last couple months. And actually, just over the last couple weeks, I'm actually seeing a drop in subscribers. Instead of where I was a few months ago, where I was getting dozens or even hundreds of new subscribers in a day, I'm now actually seeing drops some days. The subscriber count for this channel keeps bouncing up and down, and it's almost as though there's a ceiling, and once I hit it, I lose a bunch of subscribers, which is really odd. And again, coupled with the fact that views are down substantially, this is another reason, folks, why I need your help to support this show. Ultimately, it may be impossible to fight back. I don't know, maybe someday there'll be a class action lawsuit by independent content creators. Or maybe the time is coming soon when the government is actually going to start pushing back on Silicon Valley for this kind of behavior. It seems as though Tulsi Gabbard's lawsuit is a step in the right direction. But in lieu of that, folks, today I need your help to keep trying to sustain this show. If you're a fan of this show, I really do need your help. You can do that in a wide variety of ways. Again, the most simple way is just to make sure that you're subscribed. Please subscribe on both YouTube and iTunes. Also, if you're active on any social media channels, please make sure that you follow or like Primo Nutmeg. Primo Nutmeg is on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, on Minds. So please make sure that you like and subscribe. Also, folks, please do write reviews. A review on Facebook and a review on iTunes really goes a long way, so please just take a minute. Also, tell your friends about the show. If you know somebody who might like one of my interviews with Noam Chomsky, Ralph Nader, Jill Stein, Ron Paul, Matt Taibbi, Richard Wolff, or this one with Kevin Carson, please tell them about it. Share it on your social media networks. We know that it'll get hidden anyway, but please try to share it at least. And finally, folks, if you can support it, please do become a patron at patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg. Again, ad revenue for this show has dropped substantially. It's essentially down to zero at this point. I'm not really making that much ad revenue at all. The only way I can keep this show going is through your generosity, so please do become a patron. By becoming a patron for only $1 a month at patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg, not only will you help keep this show going, but you'll also get access to hours and hours of forgotten content from the earlier seasons. There's some real gems in there, so please do become a patron for just $1 a month. Again, all you have to do is go to patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg, sign up, become a patron, and you'll get charged $1 a month, and you'll keep the show going. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. I do hope to go into these topics in a little bit more depth on the next episode of the show. But right now, without any further ado, let's get to this interview with Kevin Carson. Kevin Carson, welcome back to Primo Nutmeg.
Hey, thanks.
So I really want to talk to you about the 21st century anarchist movement. What exactly is the movement today? How did it maybe evolve out of the 90s, out of the Zapatistas and the WTO movement? How would you characterize the last 20 years or so of the anarchist movement?
That's something so broad I don't really feel confident to make a generalization about, because my knowledge is fairly uneven, and I tend to focus on the specific tendencies and forms of praxis that are most relevant to my own research interests, and be pretty oblivious to everything else. But some of the currents that have been most important or influential to me have been, well, basically the whole current post-1994 horizontalist movements going up through the Arab Spring, M15, Occupy, and to offshoots of that form of praxis like Black Lives Matter and the anti-pipeline movements and so on. The new municipalist movements that grew out of M15 in Spain and have linked up with either pre-existing movements or offshoots around the world, in places like the Cleveland Evergreen Initiative, the cooperative movement in Jackson, and so on. And I'm also pretty heavily influenced ideologically in recent years just by autonomism, the work of writers like Tony Negri, Harry Cleaver, and so forth, and commons-based counter-economics, not only growing originally out of Eleanor Ostrom, but the commons-based local economies that are being promoted by outlets like Shareable online. So I guess those would be the big things for me. Also, I've read a lot of Graeber and James C. Scott, but just generally speaking, I tend to think of myself as an anarchist without adjectives. I try to be open to the whole variety of possibilities of organizational practice that people come up with on their own in different localities throughout all the nooks and crannies of history without trying to subject it to any single organizational template.
Well, I imagine, though, when we define what anarchism is and what it is not, I mean, you do have to draw lines at some point, right? And I think that you, even in our previous conversations, have kind of alluded to that you do not consider anarcho-capitalism or this sort of, right-wing libertarianism to be in this, it's not really the same thing as anarchism as you would understand it, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Just, in the sense of ideological history. And, there are tendencies on the left that I would not consider, to fall under the textbook definition of anarchism or within history of anarchism as a defined movement. But that doesn't mean, I exclude ad hoc cooperation on a case-by-case basis. I really don't see any, official form of anarchism as an ideology becoming like this, the basis around which a post-capitalist society crystallizes. Anyway, it's going to be the crystallization of a whole lot of different forms of praxis that are decentralist or libertarian in a small L way that are being developed right now as just practical responses to the problems we face in decaying stages of capitalism.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute before we get into really the thinkers or ideology. What do you think are some practical, real-world examples of a movement towards an anarchist society? I know that you mentioned municipalism.
Well, yeah, if you go to the P2P Station blog or Shareable or ROAR, which is an acronym for Reflections on a Revolution, and just keep up with their feeds. They're constantly reporting on stories of local movements like in Barcelona and Como, the municipalist movement in Madrid, Bologna, all over Europe, Preston in the UK. I mentioned Cleveland and Jackson in the United States, and it's just all kinds of particular nuts and bolts organizational models like community land trusts, community hubs, co-housing developments with facilities for direct production for use built into them, micro villages, free Wi-Fi, local currencies, all sorts of things like that, all very broadly focused on the idea of the commons and on shifting the meeting of necessities of life from the cash nexus and the wage system into direct production for use in the commons sector, and on the local community as a platform supporting all these things.
So when you look at something like cryptocurrencies, do you think that that is a movement towards a freer society, or do you think that the nature of those currencies and the private production of them, do you think that that's a step in the wrong direction?
I think going further back to things like Tom Greco's mutual credit clearing systems of alternative currency and Let's systems and things of that sort are all very broadly a promising trend, and I think there's a lot of promise in adopting digital technology like the blockchain to the same project. Bitcoin itself, I tend to be pretty hostile to because it has all the characteristics that right-wing gold bugs tend to like. It's a deflationary medium that tends towards concentration in a few hands rather than facilitating liquidity between the little folks, which I really don't like. But just using blockchain ledgers as an accounting mechanism for something like Greco's system, I think, it's a really promising idea.
So I'd like to kind of delve into these different thinkers, of the modern age of anarchism. And, I'd love to get your thoughts on the contributions that they made. And the first person I want to discuss is Noam Chomsky, somebody who's been on this show several times now. And, just a giant figure in the world of not just libertarian thought, but also linguistics.
Well, just in terms of his ideology, I haven't followed it very closely in recent years. I would say, just generally speaking, I'm, somewhat softer or less hostile toward his reformist tendencies and his views on social democracy than I used to be. I mean, I've always said that, social democracy and neoliberal capitalism of the Reagan and Thatcher variety are equally statist, and if I had to choose between one or the other, I wouldn't hesitate to choose living under social democracy, because I prefer the form of statism whose boot weighs less oppressively on my neck. But just generally speaking, I'm more open to the idea of what Andre Gortz called non-reformist reforms, and on the idea of reform as something you can go through on the path towards systemic change rather than necessarily around, so long as you don't give away all your cards to it or put all your eggs in that basket or whatever, and you retain the agency to operate outside of it, and pursue multiple simultaneous paths. I still don't see things like social democracy or the Bernie-crats or Corbynism or whatever as a primary path for achieving a post-state, post-capitalist society, but I see them as things that could at least create a relatively libertarian and benign background environment for the stuff that really is important, like building the counter institutions on the ground, building the structure of the new society, and the shell of the old, as the old cliche goes. But for me, Chomsky's main influence was not ideological in terms of any kind of coherent vision of the future so much as it was of my understanding of the past. He probably did more for me than any other thinker in introducing me to just a horrible history of coercion involved in American and European imperialism, and the whole violent history behind the origin of capitalism. To the other most influential figures for me, Gabriel Kolko, with his work on the final stages of World War II and the crafting of the post-war economic order, and William Blum's book, his book, Killing Hope, on the history of U.S. covert interventions around the world since World War II, are both things that Chomsky's footnotes actually introduced me to. I think I read Chomsky's book, Deterring Democracy, was the first book of his I read in 1999, and that led me to reading a lot of his other major books on foreign policy and the history of imperialism, and playing footnote hockey, pursuing a lot of his recommendations like Kolko and Bloom, and just really radicalized my understanding of foreign affairs.
Chomsky's an interesting figure for many different reasons, but one reason that I guess struggle with, what he says and what he writes sometimes is that he's extremely pragmatic, to the point of maybe sometimes I can't really follow if he's advocating for something that is an ideal solution or something that, we should just sort of compromise on. I know that during the 2016 election, he was saying that people in swing states should vote for Hillary Clinton. He also repeatedly says, in the real world, we should do this. In the real world, we should do that. But there's also instances where he seems to be saying that we should, even in an ideal society, be advocating for some sort of seemingly non-libertarian solutions. And actually something that I brought up to him about you was gun control. I know that you've written against gun control, and you talked about how the Black Panthers had used firearms to kind of protect themselves when they were building their movement. And Noam Chomsky seemed to push back on that.
First of all, that's utter, total illusion. Has no relation to the actual world. Now let's take the Black Panther case. I suppose you had given assault rifles to the Black Panthers. Would that have helped them? No. The state would have come in with tanks. Give them anti-tank weapons. The state will come in with B-52s. The balance of power is overwhelmingly in the force of the state. The idea that any armed resistance to the state is conceivable is kind of like having a debate about the best ice cream cones on Mars. We're not even talking about the real world.
So I don't know if maybe you have any sort of response on at least that issue.
Let me step back first, to the broader point of what we're doing in the real world practically versus the ultimate goal. I suppose I've gradually shifted to being one of those people who would say, just for purely strategic reasons, push for, ranked choice voting, promote radicals in the party primaries, as far left as you want to go, but in the end, hold your nose and vote for whoever on the ballot is most likely to get Trump and the fascists out in the short run, because I would see even the most contemptible centrist DNC mediocrity on the ballot as being at least a way of giving off the worst of the immediate fascist onslaught and buying time for a lot of other things like demographic shift, leftward demographic shift towards left-leaning millennials, towards institution buildings, towards the United States becoming less wide and right-wing over time, so we can buy the breathing space we need for actually building the kind of positive society we want. So I don't necessarily see the practical assessments like that as being in any way at odds with ultimate or ideal goals. I just see them as a means that with a very limited purpose, because I see the alternatives as very dubious or implausible. The accelerationist proposals for making things worse before they get better, or pushing the system towards the breaking point, because I ultimately don't see what faster left-wing shift we're going to get, or faster progress we're going to get in the long run by throwing the election in the short run and allowing fascists to seize power, for several years or a decade or whatever before we reach the tipping point. I think it would be much easier to negotiate the transition even under someone really horrible like Clinton than I see any plausible accelerationist or revolutionary scenario. And as far as the social democratic stuff, again, I see that as more of, even electing someone like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn as probably the best case realistic scenario, in which case it would create much more benign background conditions for the kinds of transformations we want to create outside the state. But either way, I think anyone who has any major hopes for achieving it primarily through the state, through the kinds of policies that eventually democratic socialist or Bernie-crat types would push through, I think they attach a lot more significance to electoral politics than I do. I'm just looking for the most benign background condition we can have for doing the important stuff. getting back to the specific question of gun control, to be honest, if you want to look it up, I did a review of the book Scott Crow edited, Setting Sights, on the history of left-wing thought on gun ownership. But my basic position is, that arguments for gun ownership by ordinary people as a way of resisting state and class oppression resonate very strongly with me. But the loudest voices in American anti-gun control culture, on the other hand, I feel very alienated from. And to be honest, I don't really feel emotionally that strongly about the issue of gun control one way or the other, because I don't think it's going to make a big difference what the law is. I think in the United States, the effects of enforcing such laws are going to be relatively limited one way or the other. Whatever benefits come to ownership of weapons by armed workers, by people of color, by LGBT groups and other marginalized people probably aren't going to be affected that much by gun law. And as far as gun violence goes, I think that has more to do with American culture, a lot of stuff going back to settler culture, the Second Great Awakening, American exceptionalism, and that sort of thing, than it does with what the specific gun laws are. So it's something, I have a lot of theoretical views on, but it's not a hot-button practical issue for me one way or the other. I think Chomsky's wrong in downplaying the extent towards which gun ownership and organized self-defense have been beneficial to marginalized people in the past. But to be honest, I don't think either the gun rights people or the gun control people are going to have much practical effect one way or the other.
So I did want to get back to the topic at hand regarding other anarchist thinkers and just, again, your thoughts on them and where you might especially agree and where you might disagree with them. And somebody who you already mentioned was David Graeber. I know that he's been very successful with the books that he's written over recent years. He was very influential in the Occupy Wall Street movement. I believe he's even the person who coined the phrase, "We are the 99%." And I just would love your thoughts on him. What do you think his contributions would be? And do you have any disagreements with his philosophy?
Well, in terms of practical contribution, probably the biggest effect he had was on Occupy itself when it was in danger of being taken over by, a fairly small clique of people from the Workers' World Party, Adbusters magazine, and so forth. In the summer of 2011, he and a small group of other horizontalists with past ties to M15 got together and met to put a stop to that and shift the basic character of the whole movement just as it was starting to crystallize, which was a really important thing. Ideologically, one of his biggest influences on me was just his discussion of what he called everyday anarchism or everyday socialism, being what ordinary people do in their relations with each other in everyday life and within the sphere of production, within corporate capitalist or state socialist managerial bureaucracy, keeping things going through their own social intellect, cooperative labor, whatever you want to call it, despite bureaucratic irrationality, and seeing that as a sort of a model of communism or anarchism that's an alternative to both corporate capitalism and to state bureaucracy. And the other big influence he had on me was on the way he saw history and the place democracies had in history as something that's been done from the beginning by ordinary people in thousands or millions of individual locations dealing with each other as equals and not as some grand abstraction created in 5th century BC Athens or in the 1780s in Philadelphia or whatever. and, bringing to my attention a lot of other things, like, pirate utopias, Croatan, and so forth. And to that extent, he dovetails quite a bit with James Scott as a historian of Zomian movements, or Zomian populations like the Cossacks, or what the progressive era called triracial isolates in the United States, Maroons, and so on. I did a paper on Graeber, yes, C4SS, in a series I called Anarchists Without Adjectives. I took Kropotkin as the model for the idea that regardless of whatever their formal hyphenated anarchist label, like Pyotr Kropotkin and Colin Ward in the UK are both self-proclaimed libertarian communists, but if you look at their actual focus, it's on all of the little nuts and bolts institutions people have created for themselves without ideological labels throughout history. The squatter communities and mutuals and friendly societies and free schools that Colin Ward wrote about, or the folk motes and guilds and so on that Kropotkin wrote about, and I see the same attitude in Graeber. I mean, he said at one point, he said he didn't want to impose any kind of schematic template on future society. He was open to whatever groups of ordinary people dealing with each other as equals came up with as expedients in any particular case, so long as nobody had an army or a bunch of cops at their back imposing their will on everybody else. That's a theme I've also seen in Elinor Ostrom, where she talked about the conditions for successful governance and creating successful commons governance institutions. They all started out with the assumption of the people directly involved in the situation having to deal with one another as equals and have an ongoing relationship with each other where they all had to live under the results of whatever they agreed on. So it wasn't the kind of one-off situation that you see simulated in the most toxic game theory environments like the prisoner's dilemma.
I was recently reading Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs, and it's an interesting book because it talks about how people self-report that their jobs are essentially meaningless. And it reminded me a lot of another anarchist thinker, Bob Black, and his famous work, The Abolition of Work.
I don't really have much to say about Bob Black on a personal level because it's been a long time since I really followed that kind of thing closely, or, his disputes with Murray Bookchin or anything like that, although I generally get the impression that he's been a very toxic individual, but had pretty much a favorable attitude towards the abolition of work. There were probably a lot of other thinkers who said the same thing better than he did, but at the time I read it, I'd say it had a positive effect on me. Other than that, I don't really have anything to say.
So somebody else I wanted to ask you about is Michael Albert.
Well, I know very little about Albert other than, his role with Hanel in promoting Pericon and Z magazine. I read his and Hanel's book on welfare economics, some time ago. I think it was in 2001, that discussed a lot of the Pericon ideas, and I have to say it doesn't strike me at all favorably, just the sheer amount of committee burden and meeting burden of processing all the information involved in the Pericon system. I don't find that appealing at all, but I really don't know much about his broader effect on the anarchist movement outside of that.
Are you familiar with the work of anarcho-primitivist John Zerzan?
Only secondhand and by reputation. I'm generally pretty unfavorable towards primitivism and much more inclined towards techno-utopian, very critical kind of techno-utopianism. But if there's a way we're ultimately going to reduce the human footprint on the earth and achieve the goals of primitivism, it's going to be through technology that causes the material inputs required for a given level of production to radically implode, and uses technological progress to promote things like circular cradle-to-cradle economies and what Buckminster Fuller called ephemeralization. It's basically going to be achieving a primitivist world through high-tech means, not through returning to medieval technology or to the Paleolithic era.
Are you familiar with the work of Gary Chartier, and do you have any...
Oh, yeah. Gary's a friend of mine. He actually, I've read a couple of his books. He writes a lot on anarchist theory from a new natural law perspective, and he's actually edited my books for me, the last several books I've written, and put them into final form for publication.
Okay, so you guys are pretty close then.
Yeah.
Has he influenced your personal thought at all, or your own philosophy?
Well, his books, I don't have them in front of me, and I can't remember the title, but his speculative stuff on natural law and anarchism, I think, helped shift me away from a dogmatic view of anarchism based on Tuckerite reading of the non-aggression principle or law of equal liberty or whatever, and towards a more consequentialist view of freedom based on total human agency and thriving, or towards the reduction of felt constraint or coercion instead.
Do you also have a relationship with Roderick Long?
Oh, yeah. He's another major figure at C4SS that was involved in initially forming it. It was Roderick who invited me to do a symposium issue on my first book, Journal of Libertarian Studies.
So do you have any thoughts on his work at all?
It's had a positive effect on me. I think he's made a lot of really useful observations from an Austrian perspective, calling into question the typical economic deductions that most right-leaning Austrians make from Austrian economic principles, calling those things into question. He's particularly his article on unequal contracts or contracts of adhesion, and how we're all, the typical right libertarian view of freedom of contract is totally acontextual. It ignores the fact that given the actual power differentials and power relations within our society, the overwhelming majority of people are only given a take it or leave it choice between signing their name to a EULA or a shrink-back contract, to a boilerplate contract written by their landlord or their employer or their public utility provider or whatever. Contracts aren't actually meetings of the minds in any real sense at all, and we need to address those power inequalities instead of just regurgitating abstract ideological principles without any regard to the real world. His article, I think, it was the Cato Unbound special issue on libertarianism and free markets. I think he wrote an article kicking it off on free markets, making things much flatter, less hierarchical, and more widely distributed. That was a really important piece of work he did. And his article on libertarian class theory was really important too.
Yeah, I think he's a fascinating thinker. I've actually been trying to get him on the show for the past 2 years, I've been emailing him. The only way to get hold of him, I guess, is an email. So if you know any other way, you'll have to let me know, because I'd love to have him on the show.
Well, yeah, it's pretty iffy. I mean, he doesn't keep up with his Twitter account, I don't think, and generally, if I want to contact him by email, I'll have to send an email to the C4SS working group, plus several different variants of his academic email that may or not be working, and it's up in the air whether he'll actually notice them for several weeks.
Well,
So,
someday.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just,
Roderick, if you're listening, you should be on here.
Thank you. Well, so yeah, again, just going back to the right-wing libertarians, the anarcho-capitalists, David Friedman to Walter Block to Hans Hermann Hoppe to Lou Rockwell to Tom Woods.
Oh, Jesus.
All these folks. I just wondered, is there any of them that you find have said anything or offer any areas of agreement that you might be able to collaborate on any sort of project?
Especially in recent years, I've seen the Hoppians becoming just pretty much a pipeline to the alt-right, and it's not really a pipeline so much as if it is a pipeline, it's a very short, very wide pipeline, more like a hula hoop. But their whole paleo-libertarian project just strikes me as incredibly authoritarian on a cultural and psychological level. So no, I don't have a whole lot positive to say about them and their economic sympathies. I'm thinking Thomas Woods is the one that's written all of the stuff criticizing distributism and criticizing radical historiography of the enclosures, isn't he?
I'm not sure.
It's been a while since I've seen that, but he's very disingenuous on that. He will accuse radical historians of enclosure of still being fixated on radical 19th century and early 20th century historiography and ignoring all the groundbreaking, more recent work showing that they really weren't that harmful, and they were generally implemented by fair, lawful processes and everything. But all of this latest revisionist scholarship he's appealing to was written in the 1960s, and since then we've had work by people like J.N. Neeson in the 90s who've come back doing much more thorough scholarship, saying, basically everything Marx and the Hammonds said about enclosure was true. So, and the stuff people like Clapham wrote as apologetic work in the 60s was just really insubstantial. So he's someone that just comes to my mind immediately as a hack who would write anything in defense of the property classes.
Well, I have to wonder too, because I don't know if, I know that you know who he is because you were on his show once, Adam Kokesh. He's running for president in 2020 with the Libertarian Party under the platform of abolishing the federal government. And I think he's taken some flack, among these folks to some extent, just because he is a right-wing libertarian anarcho-capitalist. But I think that he's reached out to the Libertarian Socialist Caucus within the Libertarian Party and wanted to work with them. And I think he's even like Cynthia McKinney went to Anarcho-Poco a few years ago, and they were kind of buddying it up. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on him and something like running for president under the platform of abolishing the federal government. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, if nothing else, it'll be interesting to see him articulate the ideas in their debates. If he actually got the nomination, it might be helpful as a propaganda platform. It reminds me of in 2004, I forget the name of the Libertarian nominee, but he sent out a lot of leftish feelers towards the Green Party at that time, talking about a shared platform on things like abolishing corporate welfare and a lot of the legal bases of monopoly and so on. I thought, it was fairly heartening. If nothing else, probably helped to create some degree of public awareness. As far as Kokesh goes, other than that, I wasn't aware that he was doing this. I just have a vague memory of him interviewing me and being fairly congenial and open in discussing my ideas on socialism at the time. But what he's done since then, I haven't been following too closely.
While we're on the subject, I did actually also want to mention, I recently had Howie Hawkins on the show, and he's a co-founder of the Green Party, and he's favored to probably be the Green Party nominee in 2020. And what I was shocked by during the interview is that he actually knows a lot about anarchist philosophy. He was kind of brought into the Green Movement by Maury Bookchin and had somewhat of a relationship with him. Do you know much about Howie Hawkins?
No, I don't. The name sounds vaguely familiar, but that's about all I can say.
Okay, yeah, again, I just was really fascinated by the fact that he seemed to know so much about anarchist thought. And, it actually reminded me of probably like 10 years ago or more. I went to this local congressional debate, and there was maybe it wasn't even congressional, I forget, but there was a Green Party candidate who was saying that the Green Party essentially stands for anarchism. She actually said that on stage. And I just was interested, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think that the Green Party is broadly in the anarchist tradition, or do you see them as something else?
I don't think I would go anywhere near as far as just saying they're in the broad anarchist tradition, but they're in a broad tradition of a lot of things that are shared by anarchists, like the idea of economic relocalization, political decentralization, and probably a lot of the commons-based economic ideas. I think decentralism and worker self-management were both things in the original Green Party platform that are still considered official ideas of theirs that are emphasized to a greater or lesser extent, depending on who the candidate is. And they're all ideas I would think would be fairly friendly and implemented in terms of the kind of atmosphere they created for anarchists to do their own thing.
Along the same lines, it's funny because I think Chomsky, even though he is, kind of classified as an anarchist, I see him as being very much in line, especially in terms of when you talk about, worker self-management, very much in line with Richard Wolff, and David Ellerman is actually somebody he's cited repeatedly. And I honestly don't even know, how you might classify them under socialism. I mean, are they libertarian socialists? Are they syndicalists, I guess? Do you see people like Richard Wolff and David Ellerman as part of the anarchist tradition, or do you see them as something separate?
I don't know a lot about Wolff. I thought he was a Marxist of some kind. I've just seen parts of his podcasts promoted at some like left-wing Labor Party sites, but I've never really gone in depth into it. Ellerman, I think, is, and I don't mean this really in a negative sense. I think just an accurate description is kind of a one-trick pony, in that his entire focus is on changing the nature of the labor contract and nothing else. And he tends to be extremely skeptical about any other kinds of socialistic or anarchistic ideas on how the state interacts with capital or enforces artificial property rights and monopolies and so on. I had a fairly long series of email exchanges with him at some point over 10 years ago, where he was promoting the idea of workers as the residual, as being automatically the residual claimant or owner of the firm under employment law as being sort of his idée fixe for everything, and downplaying the significance of anything else. And I specifically mentioned anarchist ideas on the role of interest-bearing credit money and absentee landlordism and that kind of thing as being instruments of rent extraction. And he pretty much just downplayed them all as being economic crankery.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. But I mean, he's very absolutist on the idea of renting labor power being morally equivalent on to a lesser degree to the buying and permanent alienation of labor power through slavery. I mean, it's just a non-negotiable thing. But other than that, I think he sees worker-controlled firms hiring capital from outside investors and renting land from landlords in fairly conventional terms, capitalist terms.
Well, Kevin, I know we've gone over an hour, and I've run through some names of people who I thought were influential anarchist thinkers of the 21st century. Is there anybody who you think is important to consider and who might be shaping the movement or, contributing anything especially interesting?
Well, in terms of shaping the movement, it's hard to say because, like I said, I'm pretty myopic in limiting my focus to, whatever I'm working on at the time, and a lot of stuff gets by me in terms of the inside baseball. And they're not, certainly not anarchists as such, but by far the stuff I've been spending the most time on and had the most recent influence on me would be the new municipalists. If you go to the lab.gov website and look at the work of thinkers like Sheila Foster and Christian Iannone. Sheila Foster's in the United States and Iannone's in Italy, and they've both been major thinkers of the new municipalism and commons-based economies. I think they have a lot to say that's relevant to praxis as it's evolving, and I've spent a lot of time reading Antonia Negri, David Harvey, and in practical terms, probably John Holloway and Massimo De Angelis. Both of them are autonomists writing on the importance of the growing commons economic sphere, or social production growing alongside the sphere of capital and developing at its expense, becoming the nucleus of the post-capitalist system. Those are both things that have been really important to me and important to what I'm working on.
Well, Kevin, again, I really do appreciate you coming back on the show to discuss these different thinkers and ideas. For folks out there who would like to follow you and stay up to date with all of your work, how can they do that?
Well, I've got a website, Kevin A. Carson, that's all one string of letters.org. It's sort of a catch-all website with links to all of my online manuscripts and my academia.edu and all that. A friend of mine, Radhika, built that website for me. And what I'm currently working on is a book called Exodus, General Idea of the Revolution in the 21st Century. And it's at a WordPress site, exodus875.wordpress.com. So if you want to see the current online drafts of the book I'm working on, it's all there. Those are the two main things. Right?
And you are also pretty active on Twitter.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's kind of equally divided between radical politics and stuff about cats and poop jokes, so it might be an acquired taste.
Well, Kevin Carson, thank you again for being back on Primo NUTMEG. I really did enjoy this conversation, and hopefully I can have you back at some point in the future.
It's been fun. Thanks a lot.